can see the firearm being pointed right at you as the bullet comes at you. Yeah, that's one thing. That's in the middle of war, right? You kind of get it. But dipping a coffee? Right? It's like, are you kidding me? This cannot be happening. They point, Steve Craig points out, it almost looks like that if they barely touched him, the guy would fall over, right? Okay, it's like everyone is in a little bit of shock. What has happened? Of course, there's implications. Dude, it's no big deal. It was only a wound to the arm. A big deal. Why? Well, first of all, because nobody's going to go in and extract that bullet with a pair of pliers. That's not the way it works. They don't have the medical ability on the battlefield to be able to do that kind of surgery. In other words, the arm gets hit, the arm is gone. You're going to take it off through a really terrible kind of experience, because once the morphine runs out in a field camp hospital, you got no painkiller other than to drink whiskey. It's the only thing you can do is try and get your brain a little inebriated, because the pain is going to be terrific as they start to saw that limb off. And this lieutenant knows it because he's seen it. So the minute he's shot, he knows. This is not just some small insignificant wound at all, because the likelihood is, once they cut the arm off, not only do you lose your arm, but the likelihood is the infection grows and you die a slow, hard death. There's not going to be a lot of hope once they take that arm off of you. All right, here we go. Let's keep going.
There were others who proffered assistance. One timidly presented his shoulder and asked the lieutenant if he cared to lean upon it. But the latter waved him away mournfully. He wore the look of one who knows he is the victim of a terrible disease.
Right, he knows.
And understands his helplessness.
He knows what's coming, right?
He again stared over the breastwork at the forest, and then, turning, went slowly rearward. He held his right wrist tenderly in his left hand, as if the wounded arm was made of very brittle glass. And the men in silence stared at the wood, then at the departing lieutenant, then at the wood, then at the lieutenant. As the wounded officer passed from the line of battle, he was enabled to see many things which, as a participant in the fight, were unknown to him. He saw a general on a black horse, gazing over the lines of blue infantry at the green woods which veiled his problems. An aide galloped furiously, dragged his horse suddenly to a halt, saluted, and presented a paper. It was, for a wonder, precisely like a historical painting. To the rear of the general and his staff, a group, composed of a bugler, 2 or 3 orderlies, and the bearer of the corps standard, all upon maniacal horses, were working like slaves to hold their ground, preserve their respectful interval, while the shells boomed in the air about them, and caused their chargers to make furious, quivering leaps.
After he's wounded, all of his senses are heightened. For those of you that studied, for example, Ambrose Bierce's incident at Owl Creek, you'll remember in that story, there's this sense that your senses are all kind of heightened when you go into the moment of stress. So here he is, bullets are whizzing around all over the place, cannon stuff going off, and he's almost like a zombie walking in the middle of the war as they lead him away, and he's starting to notice things that he didn't even notice before. He is almost stupefied as he is led away, wounded. And of course, it's already hitting him that a wound in the American Civil War is almost as bad as a mortal shot to the head that would kill you outright. Because you got to go through this process of, going to the doctor, going to the hospital.
A battery, a tumultuous and shining mass, was swirling toward the right.
Top of first lines of page 511. Read them with me, please.
The cries of the riders shouting blame and praise, menace and encouragement, and last the roar of the wheels, the slant of the glistening guns, brought the lieutenant to an intent pause. The battery swept in curves that stirred the heart. It made halts as dramatic as the crash of a wave on the rocks, and when it fled onward, this aggregation of wheels Levers, motors, had a beautiful unity, as if it were a missile. The sound of it was a war chorus that reached into the depths of man's emotion. The lieutenant, still holding his arm as if it were of glass, stood watching this battery until all detail of it was lost, save the figures of the riders, which rose and fell and waved lashes over the black mass. Later he turned his eyes toward the battle, where the shooting sometimes crackled like bushfires, sometimes sputtered with exasperating irregularity, and sometimes reverberated like the thunder. He saw the smoke rolling upward and saw crowds of men who ran and cheered or stood and blazed away at the inscrutable distance. He came upon some stragglers, and they told him how to find the field hospital. They described its exact location. In fact, these men, no longer having part in the battle, knew more of it than others. They told the performance of every corps, every division, the opinion of every general. The lieutenant, carrying his wounded arm rearward, looked upon them with wonder. At the roadside, a brigade was making coffee and buzzing with talk like a girls' boarding school. Several officers came out to him.
Top of page 512.
Concerning things of which he knew nothing. One, seeing his arm, began to scold. "Why, man, that's no way to do. You want to fix that thing." He appropriated the lieutenant and the lieutenant's wound. He cut the sleeve and laid bare the arm, every nerve of which softly fluttered under his touch. He bound his handkerchief over the wound, scolding away in the meantime. His tone allowed one to think that he was in the habit of being wounded every day. The lieutenant hung his head, feeling in this presence that he did not know how to be correctly wounded.
It's a point we want to make for our notes right now. When you are in battle, and you have been told as a soldier that you have to be brave and strong, how do you respond to being wounded? Right? What's the best way to respond to being wounded? Is it to start screaming when you're in pain? Or is it to pretend like it's no big deal? Our lieutenant will kind of play the latter game, won't he? It's all right. It's no big deal. My right arm got jacked. I'm carrying it with my left hand. It ain't no thing. Where's the hospital? I guess I got to get to the hospital. And then somebody sees him and says, whoa, 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 dude. We need to at least try and get that thing bandaged up a bit. Notice the line. He wasn't sure how he was supposed to respond now that he was wounded. Do I act like it ain't no thing? Or do I in fact let everybody know I'm in some extreme pain, especially the nerves? It's really painful. Of course, what's the real pain? The real pain is mental, isn't it? His knowledge that in the moment that he got shot in the arm, he knows what probably is coming in his future, right? By the way, when Crane publishes this story, most people do not even know what kinds of things happen in the battles of the American Civil War. There isn't any kind of CNN or embedded journalists, right? Okay, so a story like this is going to shock a lot of readers of Crane's day who said, whoa, is this really what it was like?
The low white tents of the hospital were grouped around an old schoolhouse. There was here a singular commotion. In the foreground, 2 ambulances interlocked wheels in the deep mud. The drivers were tossing the blame of it back and forth, gesticulating and berating, while from the ambulances, both crammed with wounded, there came an occasional groan. An interminable crowd of bandaged men were coming and going. Great numbers sat under the trees, nursing heads or arms or legs. There was a dispute of some kind raging on the steps of the schoolhouse. Sitting with his back against a tree, a man with a face as gray as a new army blanket was serenely smoking a corncob pipe. The lieutenant wished to rush forward and inform him that he was dying. A busy surgeon was passing near the lieutenant. "Good morning," he said with a friendly smile. Then he caught sight of the lieutenant's arm, and his face at once changed. "Well, let's have a look at it." He seemed possessed suddenly of a great contempt for the lieutenant, This wound evidently placed the latter on a very low social plane. The doctor cried out impatiently, "What muttonhead had tied it up that way anyhow?" The lieutenant answered, "Oh, a man." When the wound was disclosed, the doctor fingered it disdainfully. He said. "You come along with me and I'll tend to you." His voice contained the same scorn as if he were saying, "You will have to go to jail."
It's significant the way Crane builds characters. Notice the doctor when he meets this lieutenant. "Oh, you got a bullet in your arm." What kind of tone would you even put in your notes he uses with this lieutenant? Notice he doesn't say, "Oh, you poor thing, you got a boo-boo, let's fix..." No. What does disdainful mean to you? Like, what does that even mean? The doctor disdainfully looks at this wound like, all right. Of course, we realize this doctor has probably in a single day seen this wound at least 50 times, right? Okay, and large numbers of soldiers brought to him with these wounds, and there ain't no way that doctor surgeon's going to be able to pull that bullet out of a bone. No way, no how. So what are they going to do? Well, let's finish the story, right?
The lieutenant had been very meek, but now his face flushed, and he looked into the doctor's eyes. "I guess I won't have it amputated," he said. "Nonsense, man, nonsense, nonsense," cried the doctor. "Come along now, I won't amputate it. Come along, don't be a baby." "Let go of me," said the lieutenant, holding back wrathfully, his glance fixed upon the door of the old schoolhouse, as sinister to him as the portals of death.
Right.
And this is the story of how the lieutenant lost his arm. When he reached home, his sisters, his mother, his wife, sobbed for a long time at the sight of the flat sleeve. "Oh well," he said, standing shamefaced amid these tears. "I don't suppose it matters so much as all that."
Now, Crane is the king of understatement. I would say that it to be. Crane is the king of understatement. He could go into vivid detail, couldn't he, about how the arm was taken off, the sound of the saw going through the bone, the screaming of the man who doesn't have any painkiller, the way in which the rehabilitation had to happen. Crane could have made this story 10 more pages long. Instead, notice all he does is have the lieutenant say to the doctor, "I don't want this arm coming off." And the doctor says, "We're not going to take your arm off. Come on, come in the hospital." And then the last line of the story says, he shows up back at home, the lieutenant, with an empty sleeve. But there's a key word there that I want you to write in your notes at level 1, and we're going to ask about it at 2A. Shame-faced. "Oh well," he said, standing shame-faced amid these tears. "I don't suppose it matters as much as all that." Shame-faced. Why, jot down at 2A, why would the lieutenant feel any shame when he shows up at home without his arm? He was in the battle. People shot bullets at him. One of those bullets found his arm. They couldn't save his life without taking off his arm. Why shame-faced, do you think? What would make this experience for the lieutenant possibly a one of shame, where he would feel embarrassed or ashamed? Let's go ahead now and work at level 2A for a few moments. Messages, themes. Obviously, we could jot down a few possible messages or themes for a short story like this. One simple one is the line, "War is hell." We, of course, have heard that phrase before, and when we get to 3A here in a moment, we will ask about films or TV shows or video games that we've ever watched or played that tell us that war is a terrible experience. This story, notice, shares the bizarre nature of war. 1 minute you're divvying up coffee as an officer, and the next minute they're sawing your arm off, and you got to go home to talk to your wife and to your kids without your arm, shamefaced. Number 2 option for messages here. Obviously, we can talk in this story about the ways in which war changes people. Changes people, right? War makes men and women different in the experience of war. Both physically different, but how else would you write it? Both physically different in what? Right. Psychologically or mentally different. It has an effect, doesn't it, on the mind in some way as well as the body. Number 3 possible message. This one has to do with the way life turns on a dime, as they say. The way in which things can happen in an instant that seem at the moment to not be that big of a deal, but then all of a sudden you go, oh, whoa, that was kind of way more important than I guess I thought that it was at the time that it happened. Let's talk 2B really quickly for a moment and talk about Stephen Crane and his naturalism. Notice that this story is told, start to finish, without any sense of pity for this lieutenant. Did you notice that? If you feel sorry for this lieutenant as you're reading the story, that's because you put it into the story. Notice it's not there. As a matter of fact, what does the doctor say to him on page 513? Some of us were raised this way in families where we were told, don't be a baby. Dude, I got a bullet in my arm, and likely they're going to take my arm off. And you're telling me I shouldn't be a little concerned about this? Oh, stop being a baby. Naturalism. The storytelling approach for Crane, let's define it again. The storytelling approach for Crane that just tells it the way it is. There's no compassion, there's no pity, there's no emotion. He just tells the story. This is what happened. And at the very end of the story, the guy goes home without his arm. Done. Let's jump to 3A. We're asking at level 3, how can we relate to a story like this? I've had readers of this story that say, wow, you know, this kind of is an unsettling story because it shows a side of war that oftentimes isn't shown so easily. But let's ask this question. What is for you the film that you've ever seen that is the most unsettling one about war? It might show you the most gruesome pictures of war and battle. Some people will have said that the first 15 or 20 minutes of Steven Spielberg's film Saving Private Ryan is one of the most disturbing bits of footage of what battle is like. Is there a scene from a movie, from a TV show, that really does portray the horrors of war, the terror of fighting in the middle of the fight, in the middle of war? Recently in the last year, Clint Eastwood made a film called American Sniper, which showed some of the fighting by some of our bravest young men and women right there in different cities in Iraq, and the ways in which so much is confusing, right, in some of those scenes. You don't know exactly where you are, and there's smoke, and there's all kinds of nastiness going on, right? What is for you your film, of all films, about someone having to be in a hospital, someone having to go through a surgery or an operation? What is that film for you? What is the TV show where something has to happen in a doctor's office or in a surgeon's room, in an ER? Do you have a movie that you can connect that way as well? What is for you your favorite film about a hero in war? Do you have one? Or what is for you your favorite video game about war where there is a heroic treatment of war? Notice, it's not going to be like this, but rather it celebrates the idea of going and fighting and possibly dying. Are there different titles that come to mind here? Let's list, by the way, in literature, what is the most famous song of war? Let's, of course, write it down. It will be Homer's classic, The Iliad, I-L-I-A-D, the story about the fight at the walls of Troy between Achilles and Hector. Of course, for those of you that are maybe familiar with Brad Pitt's film Troy, the telling of the Iliad is, of course, that story, right? And the Trojan horse story to follow that celebrates war. In the Roman tradition, it is Virgil's poem, the Aeneid, A-E-N-I-D. These are titles that you will study in your senior year with me. But we go ahead and mention them now. The Aeneid, the great Roman story of war and battle and fighting. In the English epic tradition, it is the epic poem Beowulf, B-E-O-W-U-L-F. Another title you'll study with me as a senior. A song of war in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. Beowulf fighting against Grendel, fighting against Grendel's mother, and then at the end of his life, fighting against a dragon. Let's talk now at 3B. What is your view of war? What is your view of fighting in a war? Do you have a sense that people who fight in wars are brave, or are they just nuts? And what about the people in the history of the world who didn't sign up to go fight in wars? They were drafted or told they had to fight. What about those people? Another 3B question. If you had to be in a conflict where there were bullets flying around, how do you think you would be? Would you be a brave person? Or would you be an afraid person? Or are those the same thing? People who are brave are just every bit as afraid. They just respond, maybe, in a different way. 3B question. What is for you one time in your life when something that seemed really inconsequential turned out to be a major deal? It's possible that you maybe once even had to write an essay on this topic. What is for you a time in your life when you had something happen to you that on first glance you thought, it's no big deal. But looking back, you go, whoa.